Hi. So for the second part of our lecture series, we want to investigate how focal axonal swellings degrade the information encoded in spike trains. So in the previous video, we investigated what happened with a single pulse trying to travel under an anomalous geometry, and we noticed that a pulse could be blocked, reflected, or transmitted, right? And that there was this eta number, this regime number, that depending on the geometrical parameters of the swelling, would allow or not the pulse to propagate, okay? So what we're going to show now are results of a follow-up paper to the previous one, which we also published it in the Journal of Computational Neuroscience a few months afterwards, okay? So the focus now is not in what happens with a single spike, but what happens to the information encoded in the entire spike train, okay? So again, our schematic cartoon is we have our set of spikes, and these spike trains contain information. They are encoding maybe a stimuli, they are encoding a decision, they are encoding some form of information. There's the whole neuroencoding going on here, right? And if neuroencoding is reliable, that means that like what the spike train that starts the travel down the axon is the same that gets on the other side. But due to the swellings, that might not be the case. Okay, so how do focal axonal swellings affect signal transmission in axons? So here's a little summary of things that can happen. Okay, in a transmission regime, pulses can be delayed, so you can change the spacing also between pulses. In the reflection regimes, we saw that a pulse splits into two. So there's a new pulse that's created, right? And this pulse traveling backwards might collide with a next pulse traveling forward, and they can be both destroyed. So you can have pulses being destroyed. The reflection might cause some delays in the spike trains, and they might change the overall spacing between pulses. And in the more dramatic case, where you have blockage, you can even have pulses destroyed and blocked altogether and transmit no information, okay? So let's look here at a little example. So I'm sending this spike train down the axon, and here are kind of like what we would measure if we put it probes like along the axon on this direction, okay? So on the first one, which is this one here, you see that, oh, this is a case where we have reflection, so you see that like the pulses are starting to split into two. Here you see the pulses colliding, okay, and they're mutually annihilating themselves. And then here is the output spike train. So what you can notice is that the input spike train is very different from the output spike train under, for instance, the reflection regime. So whatever information was encoded either in this frequency or in this firing rate or within this spike times, that's going to be completely different from what actually effectively reaches the other neurons, okay? So another interesting effect that takes place happens actually as a non-trivial interaction between two spikes. So remember that we're talking about a nonlinear partial differential equation that has a complicated interplay with an inhomogeneous operator that takes into account the varying geometry, so wild effects can take place. This is an example of one of them. So here we have two pulses that are very close together. So I place them almost as close as they can be, constrained only by the refractory period of the system. That is the time that it needs to the membrane to kind of like generate a second spike, okay? So you can't put two spikes closer than these two if it's in a Gumu model, which what we used in the simulations, okay? So then we send these two spikes down the axon, and here we're talking in a regime that still allows for transmission. So if you send a single spike, that spike would propagate without much problems. But if you send a pair of spikes to packed together, then look what happens. Once the first spike reaches the region where you're changing the geometry, the spike starts changing its profile, and it delays a little bit, and as a consequence, the spike right behind falls into the refractory period of the spike ahead, and as a consequence, it gets deleted. So it's kind of like a car pile-up collision, right? You have these two spikes too close together, this guy starts adjusting its profile, and boom, this spike behind hits the refractory period of the pulse ahead, and it gets deleted. So as a consequence, you started with two spikes over here, and you ended up with only one spike on the other side. Okay? But surprisingly, not surprisingly, if the two spikes are very far ahead, then this effect doesn't happen. Okay, so kind of like then this one, if the second spike is sufficiently far from the first one, then this guy is going to change its profile, but it's not gonna continue to move on, and that's not gonna generate this kind of pile-up interaction between them, and you'll still have two propagated pulses. So in some cases, you will have the both pulses propagating, and in some cases, you'll have only one. Okay, and of course, this is going to penalize higher frequencies more heavily than the lower frequencies. Okay, so suddenly we're talking that at a single cell level, we're going to have confusion already in the frequency transmission on these signals. Okay, so let's introduce a little framework to classify neural responses. Okay, so very broadly, just let's imagine here that I have two stimuli classes, stimulus 1 and stimulus 2. And every time I present stimulus 1, the system responds in a certain way, so it generates spike trains that we can kind of like, in this sort of like pictorial space here, represent each spike train as one of these dots, okay? And when you present stimulus 1, you have response 1, and you can kind of like, and even though the spike trains aren't exactly the same, you can kind of categorize them as the response for that particular stimuli, okay? And if you present another stimuli, let's say stimulus 2, then you generate a different family of spike trains, even if they're not exactly the same. So, and you can kind of cluster these two response classes, okay? You can say, oh, these guys are clearly responses from spike 1, from stimulus 1. These guys are clear responses from stimulus 2. And there is not much overlap. There's not much confusion between these classes, okay? So, and an important notion here is that we're going to have like a classifier threshold that will be able to let you discriminate, well, if you see a spike train, from which stimuli you think it was generated and which family does it belong, okay? So just to add a little notation, if these two sets are completely disjoint, that is far apart, then we can put a classifier right in the middle, okay? And here's and this would lead in more dimensions to a diagonal matrix. Okay, so you're saying that all spike trains. So, for example, here is like our diagonal matrix, and I would say that all the responses for 1 are so all the responses that are responses 1 are elicited by stimulus 1, and all the responses elicited by stimulus 2 are given by R2, and there's absolutely no overlap. This will lead to a diagonal matrix, okay? Now, if you had a system in which the two classes, in which there was little discrimination between the two classes, then you would get a matrix that looks very off diagonal, okay? So here's an example where if you have just like two random, that the classes are randomly distributed, and then you get something that is like sort of like balanced like this. So then if you see a spike, well, you can't really tell which class it belongs, so your classification is as good as guessing, and that's because your sets are the sets are overlapping too much with each other, okay? So So this is the notion. Non-overlapping sets will correspond to diagonal matrix. Overlapping sets will correspond to full matrices, and the more the more diagonal your confusion matrix is, the more the information is reliably transmitted. Okay, the closer to this thing, then kind of like you already see that, like, oh, then like there's no information being transmitted. You're just kind of like, and there's no classification happening. You're basically guessing. Okay, so this formulation here for this matrix formulations allows you to then take, let's say, 10 stimulus classes and look at 10 response classes and then see kind of like how they interact one with each other. Okay, so if the system is healthy, you expect the matrix to be somewhat diagonal. So, okay, so maybe it's roughly diagonal, but you might confuse this guy by its closest neighbors. And that would be kind of like a reasonable system that can transmit information in a reasonable way. Okay, so spike trains can be altered along axonal propagation. Okay, so here we would have the two sets before propagation, and here we'll see the two sets after propagation. Okay, and if this is a healthy axon, well, then what we expect is that okay, we start with a matrix that looks somewhat like diagonal, but propagating wouldn't cause too much harm to those spike trains. So even if they shuffle and change a little bit, it's very clear that you can still discriminate the two classes and that they're still sufficiently far apart. In other words, that the matrix that would come out here after propagation, right, will still look pretty much diagonal as well. Okay. Now, what would a mild injury be? Well, we're calling a mild injury something that, well, after propagation, the responses get distorted in such a way that the healthy classifier here is now a very bad criteria to discriminate the modified spike trains. Instead, but there is another classifier here in red, in pink, okay, that if you, instead of using your old classifier, you use this new classifier, you could still discriminate the two classes relatively well, okay? So that means that, like, if you adjust your criteria, you can still discriminate between the two classes, okay? So this means that, well, you would have here a jittered matrix. So here, if you use this classifier, this will lead you to a matrix that is like basically roughly of the same color. And if you use this classifier, you would recover a somewhat diagonal structure, okay? And so the question is, if we look at the spike, and so what is a good criteria then? Like, what is a good metric to say, oh, this spike train is very similar, looks similar to that other spike train. So how are you going to metrify how similar two spike trains are? Okay, and this answer was given by Jonathan Victor a while ago with his framework of the spike train metric. So the idea is, like, let's assume that spike trains are made of zeros and ones, okay? So if you see a 1 at time t, that means you have a spike at time t, okay? And and let's add the following ingredients. Well, if we're trying to compare spike train A with a spike train B, let's say it would cost 1 to create a spike on the top of spike train A, it would cost 1 to delete a pulse, and it would cost Q times delta T to shift a pulse by delta T. So we have these ingredients that tells you how costly it is to transform one spike train in the other. Okay, so let's look at kind of like an example. So here is spike train A given by these spikes over here, and here spike train B given by these other spikes over here. Okay. And the idea as well, so how far is this spike train from this, okay? And you see, well, this guy, he wanted him to be shifted. Here you want this guy to be shifted as well for a little bit. Here you want this guy to be shifted a little bit. So, okay, these guys just got shifted. Notice that right here we had to create a spike, okay? And here we had to delete a spike. And here we had to create another spike as well, okay? So you can think, I like to think this a little bit as like a Hanoi Tower problem, which is how do you transform this guy into this guy with the minimum amount of moves, and that minimal amount of moves is the distance between the two spike trains, okay? So so here's what our results look like. We evaluated then confusion matrices for Poisson spike trains before an axonal injury. So Poisson spike trains are widely studied and used to model a lot of spike trains, and that means that we're generating spike trains in which the probability that you get a spike at time t follows a Poisson process with a certain intensity. Okay, so that intensity of the Poisson process is also, we're going to call it like the firing rate of that of that class. Okay, so in this example, we generate families. So we generate spike trains from families of Poisson spike trains with increasing intensities. Okay, so they increase from 1 to 10. So a Poisson spike train of intensity 1 in our normalized scales means that like the pulses are typically very far apart from each other. Okay, and with 10, it means that the pulses are very far, close to each other. Okay, so the interspike interval is really smaller, or in other words, the firing rate is really higher. Okay, so we're generating 10 classes from 1 to 10 equally spaced. Okay, and before injury, okay, we get somewhat a diagonal structure. So what does it mean? Well, it means that like if you pick a spike train, let's say that was generated by a Poisson process of intensity 6, most of the time it's classified as a Poisson train of intensity 6, although sometimes it might be confused as an intensity of 5 or an intensity of 7. So they might get confused to their closest neighbors if it happens to be an instance of a Poisson train. If it happens to be a realization with more spikes, then it can be confused as belonging to a class of a firing rate above. If it's a realization with a little bit less of spikes than average, then it might be confused as a spike train from a class below. But nothing crazy happens, right? Like, so a spike train of 6 is either confused with 1 above and 1 below, but it's not going to be confused by classes too far apart, so you're still going to have a somewhat diagonal structure, okay? So we simulate these spike trains, we propagate them using the methods that we discussed on the previous videos, so the spatiotemporal pseudospectral methods, and then we record after they passed the swellings, and we compare, what happened here? And notice that something very interesting happened. So this diagonal now got distorted. Okay, so instead of going all the way here close to 10, you see that the diagonal starts following the diagonal line, but then it bends right here. Okay, so this means that a firing rate that was supposed to be of a firing rate of 10 is now confused most of the time as a firing rate of 6, because you lost a lot of spikes due to that pile-up effect. Okay, so the pile-up effect is an effect that happens even during transmission. So if you have a little bit of injury, not enough to reflect the pulses, not enough to block the pulses, that might be enough to create these pile-up effects and not let two spikes too close together propagate, which will ultimately make you confuse firing rates for higher frequencies by their counterparts of lower frequencies. So here, the confusion matrix is a great framework for this, because it's saying that, hey, actually, if suppose you're trying to encode a certain information at this frequency, and the rest of the network is waiting for your signal at that specific frequency, then that signal will never arrive, because you're trying to send a 10, but what you're effectively sending is a 6 due to the swellings. So here you can kind of like see this picture on and mapping to the corresponding matrices. Okay, so here you would have, okay, if it's healthy, these guys would be, all the classes would be sufficiently separated. If you put under mild injury, that is injury that still allows for transmission, boom, if you use the same classifier as before, so if you use the same criteria as before, so that is this, then this is a bad criteria for this, and you get a lot of confusion, okay? But there is still a new classifier that you can use, okay, that if you tweak the new classifier, you can, if you change your criteria, you can still get a somewhat diagonal structure, okay? So so we performed a lot of simulations on this. I think we did like 400 simulations for each one, for each family, for each one of the 10 classes, and saw how each one of them got confused, and then we encapsulated all that information into this confusion matrix, okay? And these confusion matrix are very interesting because you can calculate what is called the transmitted information of the system based on this confusion matrix, okay? So here is the expression for the transmitted information H, and it's a somewhat complicated expression, which I don't want to enter here too much on the technical details of the information theory pieces of it. You should look at the work of Jonathan Victor for this. But I'll give a little intuition, okay? If you get a matrix that looks like this, then you have maximum information, okay? So you're transmitting as much information as you can. You got a perfect diagonal. So this would be the case in which you maximize the transmitted information. Here, it would be a case where you would have a almost optimal, right? Semi-perfect transmission of information. You make a little bit of mistakes, but they're really small, and while this guy transmits absolutely no information, you're as good as guessing from, like tossing a coin to figure out which classes that spike train belongs to, because there's no information conveyed on this, and this is almost as bad as this, maybe a little bit better. Okay, so here you have perfect, full information, no information, almost full, almost none information transmitted. And this formula, what it does, is that it gives you the right way to penalize your score proportionally to the off-diagonal terms. Okay, so the off-diagonal terms are properly penalized by this expression, and now if we have an expression like this, we can start calculating what was the loss of transmitted information in the system. Okay, so when we do that, we looked at so here it is, and we did this. So we evaluated that that expression for the 10 classes, for the 10 Poisson classes, and we also started to change the length of the spike trains. So we made the spike trains bigger and bigger to see, if they get bigger, it's harder to confuse, or it's easier to confuse. So we studied the scaling of the relative loss of transmitted information with the length, okay? And basically we got this pattern right here, okay? And so what is interesting to note is that, like, yeah, we do expect kind of like a relative loss of information around 10%. Okay, so I think that is a really interesting result. So it shows you that even when the system still allows for transmission of a single pulse, it can still create all sorts of confusion, and it will transmit less information than the healthy system. And further on the lectures, we're going to explore how what are the consequences in a network setup of having neurons sending confusing signals, confusing information, or not processing sufficiently enough information as their healthy counterparts in the network, and how that can destabilize the functionality of the system. Okay? Well, thank you very much for watching.